The thing about this is that your return for the actual people working on the land. Now, that can be a farmer. David Ricardo developed his theories primarily looking at agricultural land use, but it actually applies just as well to commercial, industrial, retailing land uses or occupations. Okay. And the argument basically says that the actual people, if you've got a hairdresser's shop, okay, your barber, his wages in return for labour and perhaps the profit for the owner of the barber shop, the enterprise owner, will always be forced down by the behaviour of land to a level which is effectively subsistence. Now, when we use that word subsistence, we usually think in terms of third world people spending all of their time scratching around, kind of trying to keep alive with, grass hut to protect them when the weather's bad, as subsistence, just barely alive. Subsistence is a broader concept than that. It's a socially determined factor. And by that I mean that if I live in East Timor, just the north of Australia, our closest neighbour, closer than New Zealand, okay, I would consider life pretty comfortable if I had a grass hut. Oddly enough, East Timorese like grass huts and mobile phones. They don't get electricity much, maybe 3 or 4 days a week. And for them, that's base level. Some East Timorese have windows, glass in their windows, and some of them might have electricity that's there for 7 days a week. And they're really, really happy and they think of themselves as really top of the tree, right? But subsistence for an East Timorese is a different standard of living because the society is different. And so the social expectations are different. You go to the United States and subsistence means, living in a house with a second-rate air conditioner. Okay, it's the bare limit for acceptable life on Earth, according to a Yankee. But it's at a standard where you've got healthcare, you've got tarred roads, probably got a motor car. You'll be complaining because it's an old one. A subsistence level would still probably have an air conditioner or at least some sort of, decent sort of heating system, because that's the base level accepted to the society of the United States. Australia is probably not far behind the United States in those kind of expectations, oddly enough, with the kind of changes that are happening in the United States. Sometimes when I talk about these things, I kind of wonder whether it's still relevant because all the poor people in the United States have to sleep on the street and whatnot. But subsistence is ultimately a social thing. What that means is that this wages line is set by social expectations. It's not set by some magic supply and demand thing in the economy. It's rather that it's set by social expectations, and then after that, it sort of finds its level. If you get that idea under your belt, then you can see some curious things that are happening in Australia. One of them is that, relatively speaking, the things that make our life comfortable are getting cheaper. And by that I mean the real things that make us more comfortable tend to be things like food and clothing and shelter. Those basic things you learn about, first couple of weeks in economics. They're actually getting cheaper. Most people wouldn't say so. We say we're going to have to work more overtime. We've got to have more people in the family working. Life's tough, but life's tough because, I had to wait for 6 months to get the latest iPhone or something. we're operating from a high level of expectations. But oddly enough, there are forces in our culture, I think, which are encouraging us to accept a lower standard of living. Can anyone suggest places where our standard of living might be being argued towards going lower? Okay, we've got our gadgets, but are there things about comfortable living that we're being talked out of pretty much as we speak? Any suggestions? No one. Okay. How about we think about energy use? I don't think it'd be unfair to say that we're being discouraged from using energy at the moment, and we're allowing its price to get extraordinarily high considering what it is. Anyone notice that?
Yeah, definitely electricity, and when if you look at fuel as well.
Yeah. Now, if you think a bit deeper, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but Australia has got an awful lot of coal. We export the stuff to China for just about nothing. Well, I mean, we make a fair bit of money out of it, but the Chinese think that it's still bargain basement prices. We've got an awful lot of coal. We could use coal a lot more and probably a lot cheaper than we're tending to at the moment. We look at oil. How much oil does Australia have? Well, it has an awful lot more than it needs for itself. And I'm told that if we were to simply close all the gates around the edge of the country, use our own gas and oil suppliers, our gas and oil would be something like half of the price that it is at present. Apparently, it instantly basically halve our, um, petrol prices at the pump. Anyone know how oil is priced in Australia?
Off the Singapore market.
Yeah, exactly. And so, even though we could have fuel, what's fuel price right now? Getting close to $2 a litre, depending on what sort you use and where you get it from. Um, we could be getting it for 70 or 80 cents a litre if we simply priced it in terms of the logistics of getting it out of the ground and getting it into the pumps in Australia. Whereas in fact, we use a very strange process, which, you can go off and study in your own time, where the price of Australian oil being sold to Australians is based on Singapore market. Anyway, that's a curious feature. Um, we're being encouraged to use less of it because we're being told that, energy is going to do dreadful things to the planet in a couple of 100 years' time. Um, the science for that is remarkably rickety. But we're being encouraged to accept a lower standard of living by, um, not using as much fuel, not using as much energy for our heating, by feeling a bit shy about putting the air conditioner on or what have you, because somehow this is a good thing if we lower our standard of living. Which, when you think about it, you stand back and you think, well, hang on, why is it a good thing to arbitrarily lower your standard of living for reasons that are very complicated when you get down to the science? Okay. And there are a number of other places where our standards of living are being encouraged to being smaller. Um, Things like the size and quality of our housing. Um, whether you can bring a family up in sort of housing that an awful lot of younger Australians are forced into, those that sort of live in the capital cities and so on. So I think about it as this question of subsistence is curious. What would happen to the wages line if, as a society, we accepted a lower standard of living?
Our wages line has fallen.
So again,
Our wages line is lower, isn't it?
that's right. That's right. And so the lower the standard of living that the community accepts, the lower this line goes and the less is available for the yellow people, which is the return for labour and enterprise, and the higher is available for rent. Now, we see this when we talk about the affordable housing problem, which is a topic from a few weeks ago, right? Now, the affordable housing problem, just remember that we got our land for nothing, basically. Captain Phillip sort of hopped off the boat, and there wasn't a real estate agent sort of offering a good deal on Sydney Harbour or Sydney Cove or whatever it was. It was free. And yet now the average Australian, young Australian, find it very difficult affording to own a house because, relatively speaking, you see, the quality of living, which is what this yellow patch represents, has been pushed down by the price of housing. Okay. So this kind of process is something which is very, very real. And if you can interpret this in your own life and sort of as you move on in your professional lives, perhaps, you'll have quite an insight into the way that the Australian economy works. Okay, I want to talk specifically now about savings and even taxation. I think we might mention that just a little bit in the recorded lecture. But you see, if we set our return for labour and enterprise, our wages line, so low that below it we can't live reasonably for what Australians think means reasonably, it means that you can't save. These people in the yellow area don't have savings in the bank. One of the curious things about Australia is that, certainly in my lifetime, when I was a young fella, a lot of people, young, old and indifferent, had reasonable savings. And certainly if you look at like families or, extended families, overall they were savers rather than borrowers. And so it might be that, young Johnny might sort of go and get a loan from his grandfather to get his business started or something, or maybe Sally and Sam, when they get married, be more likely to get a lot of their funding from their family. They tend to be savers rather than borrowers. But where does savings come from? Can people on wages or Bill the barber running his enterprise, his little barber shop, paying rent for his shop, do they have the capacity to do saving in this situation? Well, the point up here is already telling you the answer to that. All savings must come from land because labour and entrepreneurial profits is being paid at subsistence. So when you're paid at subsistence, it means everything that comes into your paycheck, into your wallet as pay, goes out as paying to keep alive. And so you're not going to be saving in that environment. And so the point here is that, okay, we'll talk about taxes as well. But the thing about it is that these extra payments that are made can't be actually burdening wages people, and for that matter, return to enterprise. One way or another, savings and taxes, even if they appear to be coming out of people's wages, they're actually being funded out of what's generally available for rent. Now, I won't go too far down that at the moment, but I'll come back to it depending on how far we get with these slides. But it's an important thing that if we able as a society or even as individuals to be able to save, in a sense, you see, if I decide to put 10% of my income into saving, I'm still going to be paying, well, I'm going to be probably spending, I'll still have to eat and I'll still have to, put petrol in the car. But what it means is I'll probably, if I make that decision, 10% of my wages is going to go to savings. It means I'm going to have to rent a cheaper place to live, right? Because I don't have as much money as I did before to do that saving. Okay, I could conceivably cut back on what I ate, but you can only go so far with that. Whereas you do have choice, again, to a certain extent, what part of town you live in. So the cheaper end of town versus the expensive end of town, the quality of property, maybe you're renting, you might be getting a 3-bedroom old house rather than a 4-bedroom new house or something, because you've chosen to do savings rather than sort of pay rent. There's a general principle or a general expression that it makes this a little bit more understandable in economics, and that is that rent or land takes the residue. Okay. Now, we saw that without really putting a big flashing spotlight over it when we were looking at our DCF calculations and all those things, because we were taking like what an accountant would say as a profit and loss statement and sort of turning it around a little bit, because normally we think of profits in a business as taking the residue. So you make your revenue with whatever you're doing, and then you take off your costs, including real estate costs, and then what's left over at the end, after you pay taxes and interest and all that sort of carry on, is what you take home as profit. Okay. What we're suggesting here is a slight rearrangement of that order, where we say, well, even the business owner, in terms of his profit, will be happy to take a certain amount home from running his business. So, someone might run a barber shop rather than earn a wage as a barber, because he says, well, if I run my own shop, I make a bit more money, I've got a better standard of living, da-di-da-di-da, and I'm willing to do all that extra work, maybe take those risks. I've got the same skills as the barber I employ, but I choose to run the shop, because of the attractions of being in business. So in a sense, you're the entrepreneur who runs the barber shop, the only reason they're doing it is because they see the value in the extra, whatever it takes, risk, effort, whatever, of running the business rather than simply being an employee. And there are an awful lot of people. In fact, years ago when, before I sort of started going around the university, I remember I was running a professional practice, and I was surprised that my employees, some of them didn't want to know anything about running the business. They were just happy to get their wages and go off and do their work, and they're really good people, and they're terrific at work, had no entrepreneurial interest at all. On the other hand, I was a bit ambitious, and I liked the idea of being in business, all that sort of carry on. And so I was, had my professional skills plus, the ambition to run my own business. And that was all fun. Now, I could not understand why people did not want to be self-employed. Anyway, that's just the psychology that you find across society and amongst the class. Some people will aspire to be really good in their jobs as employees. Others will want to go out and start their own business. But in the end, you see, the return for labour and for running your own business, what I'm calling enterprise here, kind of all this mix. But the cost of land is sort of tugging at the other side of the rope. Okay, we've mentioned savings, and I mentioned taxes also must come out of land. There's an awful lot you can do with that fact that taxes ultimately come out of land, because you'd say to people, well, hang on, I pay GST when I go down and, I don't know, buy a new basketball because I like playing basketball, a new set of golf clubs or whatever. I pay tax, I pay GST. And when I get my salary check, the ATO has already kind of pulled probably, a quarter of it out from under me, right? So I'm paying tax. I'm not some landowner. Well, again, you see, the curiosity there is that if the ATO was to close up shop and say, we're going to sack all of those good-for-nothings down in Canberra. Oh, hang on, you might have some Canberra people in the class. And so let's imagine we didn't have to charge any income tax anymore. What would happen? Well, I want to explore that a little bit, but just to give you a little bit of a hint, maybe a bit of a spoiler, is that initially, if I didn't have to pay income tax, my wages would rise. But after all, the landlord or the person I bought land from would wake up and they'd put the rent up.